Ever wondered what it's really going to take to reach net zero? What if cities could clean the air instead of polluting it? And could microbes hold the key to repairing the planet? Welcome to Future Now, the brand new climate innovation podcast brought to you by Springwise, the global innovation platform. The next big climate solution is out there. You just might not have heard of it yet. Join myself, Matilda Cox, and Springwise's commissioning editor, Matt Hempstead, along with a host of special guests, where we'll be exploring the bold ideas, breakthrough technologies, and big questions shaping a sustainable future. Just search Future Now on your usual podcasting platform and subscribe for a monthly dose of the innovation that matters.
Hello and welcome along to COP30 Covered, the daily podcast show from the award-winning edie editorial team, in which we bring you all of the latest news and views from the UN's 2025 Climate Summit, which is taking place right now in Brazil. In today's episode, we ask, is forest funding fit for purpose? Has the global methane pledge been a success? And what does the Pope have to say about the COP? We answer your most burning COP questions in 45 minutes or less per episode. So yes, welcome back to COP30 Covered from edie. You're listening to the voice of edie's content editor, Sarah, and it is currently Tuesday, the 18th of November 2025. Joining me online to record this podcast, I have our editor, Matt Mace.
Hello.
And also Matilda Cox, who is content editor at Springwise.
Hello.
And potentially Matt's dog, depending on how loud he is if he decides to bark or snore, but we'll get to that if we get to it. So how is everyone keeping? Matt, I'll start with you.
Yeah, not too bad. I was saying there's a real contrast in the weather compared to like UK to what the delegates experience in Belem. There's a real cold snap here, but the heat and humidity, as we know, is still kind of causing some disruptions out in the blue zone. So it's quite a contrast to kind of get your head into COP mode when you're kind of shivering under blankets, but it's still pretty good. We've just had obviously the draft texts come out, so I've just been combing through the 50, 60, 70 odd points in there, getting well attuned to the language that the UN decides to use once more. So all busy.
Yeah, I've been doing the same, Matt. And Matilda, what's been keeping the team at Springwise busy during COP?
We've been helping out where we can with the edie team. We're kind of taking more of a sort of a broader look at how innovations sort of changed over the years since the Paris Agreement. And then we're also kind of looking to put together our sort of Springwise takeover of the edie podcast that's coming later this week.
Great, and I can tell our lovely listeners more about that in a moment. But for today, I'm just going to recap on some of our news in brief. The top story being, as Matt said, that the first draft proposal is out, and at the moment they're calling it the Montreal decision. So it shows that there's no debate on whether countries believe that access to a healthy environment is a human right, which is really interesting after this summer's landmark ruling on climate and human rights by the ICJ. But as Matt said, there's still about 70 different points, some of them with multiple options, including no text options, which shows that countries are still bickering about whether they should be required to agree on new adaptation finance plans or emissions reduction plans this year. And it's also, what stood out to me is that the language on the energy transition is really different than a couple of years ago. There's no mention of any phasing out or down of fossil fuels. There are some no agreement options. There are some quite strong options, and there are options including countries progressively overcoming their fossil fuel dependence. So there's some interesting language in there. Do take a look through if you're so inclined. Also out from the UN overnight, it's published its first comprehensive stocktake of the global methane pledge since it launched in 2021. So the pledge requires supporting countries to commit to reducing methane from energy by 30% by 2030. And thankfully, the UN has concluded that this pledge is still achievable, even though methane emissions have crept a little bit higher. because the case for investing in reductions is just so strong. It pays back multiple times over very quickly. But it does say that new regulations are needed to achieve the pledge. And then last but by no means least, quote that I didn't expect to land in my inbox this morning was from the Pope. So the Pope has been praising churches across the global south for taking part in the COP. He says that faith leaders who are there are doing the right thing by choosing hope and action over despair and responding properly to what he calls as God's creation crying out. So this is the extreme weather we've seen recently. And quite surprisingly for a Pope, he's actually talked about things like policy and the economy and the Paris Agreement, saying that stronger climate action is key. So some really interesting stuff coming out overnight. And outside of all of that, the thematic agenda continues at a pace as well. So we've only got 3 more thematic days at the COP, including today. And the focus this week is very much on the nature side of things. So just to recap, in case you didn't tune in yesterday, the themes for yesterday and today include forests, oceans and biodiversity. So we're focusing on that forest piece today before moving on to all things agriculture tomorrow. I know the two are linked, but I think it would do them a disservice to try and lump them all in one piece. And Matt, I'd like to come to you for a scene setter on today's topic, please.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, forests have been very much in the spotlight for this COP, given the location in the heart of the Amazon, and we know that that is an area that's being deforested at an alarming rate. I think over 40% of global tropical deforestation occurs in Brazil. And we lose 5 million hectares of forest just annually to land clearing for various things like agriculture, livestock farming, logging activities, to just produce stuff that we as humans consume, right? I used to always do the kind of like, it's the size of however many football pitches, but quite frankly, I think after like 15 football pitches, it becomes quite hard to figure out how big that is. I think the kind of main thing, and anchoring this back to the Amazon, is that the Amazon was essentially a carbon sink. So it would store more carbon than it emits, but because of the rate of deforestation that happens there, it's now essentially a carbon source. It emits more than it's able to store because of the activities there, which is pretty kind of, I think, bleak in terms of what it is that it's trying to do and achieve there. So it's definitely something that needs to change. Luckily, forest loss has slowed down since the 1990s, but it's still unsustainably high. Tropical habitats are among the most vulnerable, and as mentioned, Brazil experienced the highest net loss of forests over the past 10 years. Translating that into finance, which is what all world leaders at COP like to do, the UN estimates that forest finance needs to be about $300 billion annually by 2030, and then almost double then by 2050. The 2030 level, so the $300 billion figure, is 3 times higher than what was provided in 2023. So there's a big gap. I feel like I've said that on every episode of this podcast. There's a big gap between what we need and what we're doing, but it's not impossible. Private investment, green bonds, carbon market projects are all starting to shape up. And countries did commit in 2022 to redirect at least $500 billion of subsidies that are currently harming nature into nature restoration through the global biodiversity framework that was set up. And as mentioned, this is an important subject for this COP, but it's also had its kind of moment in previous COPs as well. COP26 in Glasgow saw 140 plus countries accounting for 90% of the world's forests pledge to halt forest loss by 2030. So there's some big kind of lofty goals to achieve, a gap to achieve them. But I think the good thing is that globally there seems to be acknowledgement of what it takes to deliver that.
I always find funny with these things. You look at the gap, you look at the figure, you're like, that's absolutely massive. And then you look at how much funding is actually going to the thing that damages in the first place. And it's always much bigger. So there's that on display at the COP. And as we'll hear from our interviewees this week, there are some great examples of how people are working collaboratively to really do local-led initiatives on the ground. But Matilda, I wanted to come to you and look at essentially innovations in the field of forest conservation and restoration. So what's the interest been like in this field? Are they moving things from these top-level commitments to action?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. There's kind of countless examples that I could give that we've seen over the last, even over the last few months, but definitely over the last kind of couple of years. And there's so many ways that tech can help in terms of protecting, in terms of restoring, and then in terms of kind of measuring forests. So there's been loads of advancements in terms of the way we kind of reforest. So whether that's kind of developing more like resilient seeds before they're planted, or using kind of drones to replant at scale. But a couple of the kind of key themes that I've noticed more and more in the last sort of year or so is the way that data is collected on forests, and then also how startups are kind of using that data and like how they're harnessing that data to make it more relevant for companies. So in terms of kind of the actual data collection, there's obviously kind of more and more cutting edge sensors, so ones that are more efficient, ones that are more sustainable, so kind of biodegradable IoT sensors. For instance, Biophonic is kind of a really interesting UK startup. So they develop under like below ground sensors that they're acoustic sensors, so they're listening to the soil to kind of measure the health. And obviously, I'm not going to go into the science of it because I don't necessarily understand, but obviously soil health is going to be a massive indicator for how successful a reforestation project can be. But then it's not just about kind of using these kind of smarter and smarter technologies. There's one story we published, I think it was only a few weeks ago, was researchers from Bristol Uni, I think, and they're just using like low cost, really simple drones to collect images of reforestation projects, so to kind of map the tree canopy, and then they can use that to kind of estimate the carbon storage of a reforestation project. And then kind of small scale community projects that don't necessarily have the funding to be doing these sort of super detailed analytics can use that data to kind of prove and verify the work that they're doing. Then on the other hand, there's also so many startups that are kind of helping organisations make better use of their like nature data, their forest data. So Dunya Analytics is a great example. So they use kind of really complex ecological science and nature data sets to help global businesses in particular with like global supply chains kind of pinpoint key risk areas. So whether that's kind of to do with deforestation, water scarcity, things like that. And then they kind of translate those risks into like actual financial metrics so that companies can actually kind of prioritize areas where nature positive strategies aren't just going to have, a hugely beneficial environmental impact, but they're going to have, a massive impact on the bottom line overall as well. So that's just kind of a couple of examples, but there's like so many exciting solutions out there.
Yeah, I'd love to do a whole episode on, just listening to the soil in general. Yeah. And it's interesting that there's this mix of questions of like how high tech do we need to go and how much do we really need to spend, and where, isn't it?
Yeah. Some of the kind of seemingly most impactful solutions, it looks like they're, it's really low tech, really simple ideas, but those actually could be much more easily scaled, particularly when it comes to kind of the global south. They can be really easily implemented and they don't take, huge amounts of training resources, but it's just kind of getting those solutions to the places where they're needed.
Of course. And key to all of this, of course, is effective finance and effective coordination, which brings us on to our special guest interview for today. So earlier today, I spoke with Jack Hurd, who serves as head of the World Economic Forum's Earth System Agenda, and he's also executive director of their Tropical Forest Alliance. So you might have actually seen a caricature of Jack in the run-up to the COP because his column in The Economist went a bit viral before the COP, the title being "If Only the Market Value of an Intact Forest Were More Obvious." So this article calls for a longer term and more comprehensive think about how we value and associate risks with nature, which is really hard where you're in regions where people are below the poverty line and they stand to make a quick buck from just chopping a tree down. So we looked at some potential solutions to that dilemma in the discussion, and Jack also talked to me about the multi-billion-dollar Tropical Forest Forever facility launched by Brazil at this COP. So here is that discussion in full. Thank you so much for your time, Jack. How are you?
Great. Thanks very much, Sarah, for having me here.
No, thank you for taking the time. I think we were just mentioning off call that you've done a little bit of a grand tour of Brazil these past few weeks. So it'd be great to hear about what you've been up to and the general vibe on the ground there.
Yeah, great. So I spent about 2 weeks in Brazil. I was in Rio for the Earthshot Awards, as well as some other programming associated with that. I was in Sao Paulo for a whole number of conversations and events around climate and nature, climate implementation, and broadly described as sort of the more corporate side of things, I think. And then I spent the last 6 days in Belem for the COP itself.
Well, thank you for grappling with the inevitable jet lag and coming on to the podcast. And Jack, I understand you're a man that wears multiple hats, including head of the Earth Systems Agenda and executive director of the Tropical Forest Alliance. So it would be great to hear a little bit more about your work.
Yeah, sure. I'm based at the World Economic Forum in Geneva. The World Economic Forum, as people may know, is about 1,000 business partnership. And we exist to improve the state of the world largely through public-private partnerships. That's the way we're set up. That's the charter of the organization. We do 3 things at the World Economic Forum, and this translates into the Earth Systems Agenda itself. We think through topics of challenge and do thought leadership and thought synthesis work. We do convenings and we manage communities of actors charged with achieving a specific outcome. And we do strategic communications work. So within that broad construct of the World Economic Forum, the Earth Systems Agenda is a relatively newly formed group. And what we're really trying to do is to make sure that there's an economic and social case for the conservation, for the restoration, and for the stewardship of the Earth systems, really terrestrial, freshwater, and oceans. These are largely systems that are highly valued by society, but they're not appropriately priced. So we're trying to build the economic and social case. We're trying to catalyze action in sort of large-scale collaborations with multiple sectors dealing with public policy, corporate practice, innovative finance, and civil society to address specific agendas. And that's where the Tropical Forest Alliance sits in, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the third thing is really to leverage innovation and to mobilize capital to create new business models or new products and services that are going to be important in bringing about that valuation, if you will, of our natural assets. So that's really what the Earth Systems Agenda is about here at the forum. The Tropical Forest Alliance, as mentioned, is one of those large sort of multi-stakeholder collaborations. It was founded about 2014, and I say that about because it had a couple of different guises before it came in to the World Economic Forum. And the primary objective was to help consumer-facing companies, these are like the Nestle's and Unilevers of the world, really understand their impact on tropical deforestation based on the assumption that once they understood their impact on deforestation, they could start making changes within their supply chains to decouple their operations from what was happening in the forest itself. In other words, how do they move toward what we call a deforestation and ecosystem conversion free value chain? And so we started that work in 2014 and sort of moved our way up the value chain, first working with these consumer-facing companies, then working with government and consumer-facing companies collaborations, getting involved with the agriculture sector traders who move most of these commodities around the world, whether it's soybean, cattle, palm oil, cocoa, cacao, coffee, et cetera. And then more recently, we've been engaging with finance institutions because I think what we realize is that there are impediments to change at the field level that largely come from misaligned policies or misaligned financial incentives. So those are the two jobs that I have: to head the Earth Systems agenda at the forum, which encompasses our forest, freshwater, and ocean work, and then more specifically with the Tropical Forest Alliance itself.
Got it. And you've mentioned the need to build the economic and social case for safeguarding and restoring critical systems, of which tropical forests and especially the Amazon are one. And this is something we saw the COP30 presidency really trying to do in the lead up to this and trying to in the early days. So we've seen lots of discourse around this, lots of coverage about their new Tropical Forest Forever facilities. But I wanted to get your view, Jack, with what you know about how this system works, about whether that specific facility and some of the other things we're seeing coming out of the COP will be effective. So what do they do and what do they maybe not do yet?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super important question, because this is the first COP in the last four, I guess, that has happened in a country that is largely agrarian or has a significant agriculture sector. And I think if we back up a little bit and look at the progress that has been made on climate over the years, I think when most people think about climate change, most people think about energy production, they think about transportation, and they think about construction. What they don't often think about is land use change, despite the fact that land use change represents about 15% of global CO2 emissions. So it's an important segment. It just hasn't had the profile, if you will, of these other sectors in the last decade, let's say. Brazil, as COP president, has really elevated land use and forestry as part of or forests, I guess, as part of the COP dialogue for a couple of different reasons. The first is that about 65% of its CO2 emissions as a country come from the land use sector. That's not common with countries with that level of economic growth. And that's primarily because it has a massive, very successful agricultural sector. It also derives a lot of its energy from hydropower, and they've long used sort of crop-based ethanol as part of their fuel mix. So they have a lot of things they've been doing that other countries have not done to date, but it is their agricultural sector and the importance of the Amazon to that agriculture sector that's really caused the COP presidency to elevate the importance of this. So the past 3 years, there's been a fair amount of conversation around the Tropical Forest Forever facility. And this mechanism exists because the most intact forests we have around the Earth are largely sit outside of the existing carbon markets. So what happens is, in order for forests to qualify for conservation or restoration or protection of forests to qualify for carbon market credits, they need to be basically under immediate threat. If they're not under immediate threat, you can't really use the carbon markets to bring resources to the conservation of that. Brazil, other countries in the Amazon, and other countries in the Congo Basin and Southeast Asia have a lot of forest land that's not under direct threat. But anybody who's ever worked in a tropical forest knows that if something's not under direct threat this year, it's highly likely it's going to be under direct threat 5, 10, 15 years from now. So the Tropical Forest Forever facility was set up to compensate countries for stabilizing their forest cover and increasing their forest cover, and then withholding resources if deforestation continues. It exists to correct a market failure, if you will, in the carbon market itself. And it's not based on the retention of CO2. It's strictly based on hectarage of conserved or restored forest. Now, this is super important. I think people really they have to understand the significance of this, because it's also not a grant facility. It's an investment facility. So what happens is it attracts in capital at low cost, which means low interest rates. The facility deploys that capital in investing in sovereign bonds and big corporate bonds, which will generate a higher return on investment. And then the difference between the higher return and the lower return gets used to compensate tropical forested countries. So it's an innovative instrument, and it's super important because it is an investment vehicle. It's not a grant facility. It's an investment vehicle. And it does a really good job in terms of its setup and its construct. And it's fair to say that it's still being constructed, but it does a really good job of tying investment to something that I mentioned earlier, something that's valued but not yet priced, and that is the intact natural forest we have around the planet. Maybe a couple other things on this that I think are important. The Tropical Forest Forever facility is one of a couple of innovative financial instruments that I think are going to be really important to conserving and ultimately reversing deforestation rates globally. There are a few other things that are also important. And I mention this because at the COP26 in 2021 in Glasgow, there was something that came out of that called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use. That declaration, of which 143 countries signed up to and representing 90% of the world's forests, said, okay, we're going to stop and reverse deforestation by 2030, and we're going to deliver sustainable economic growth and rural transition. Those two different phrases appeal to two different types of audiences. Some people really focus in on stopping deforestation, and some people really focus on, yes, that's important, and we need sustainable economic growth and rural transition. I mention this because I think what's come out of, it's taken a number of years for this to sort of filter through, but there is now sort of an emerging consensus on the types of things that are going to be necessary to actually deliver on that, stopping and reversing deforestation and delivering sustained economic growth. The United Nations Environment Program and a group of governments that sort of goes by the name of the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership recently put out a plan, and they called it a forest financing roadmap. And that forest financing roadmap says basically there's three broad types of instruments. There's some innovative finance, there's some private sector capital, and there's public expenditure. The Tropical Forest Forever facility sort of sits within this innovative finance bucket. So new, interesting ways to think about driving resources into achieving the goals of that Glasgow Leaders Declaration. And yet, arguably the more important thing that needs to happen, and I'm not trying to denigrate the importance of the Tropical Forest Forever facility, but arguably the more important thing that needs to happen is we need to find ways to drive private sector capital into a forest bioeconomy and drive private sector capital into reforming and refining, if you will, the agriculture production model, which sort of lies at the root of deforestation in the first place. And then I guess the third bit is really public expenditure. How can governments think about subsidy reform? How can they think about channeling resources that they do have on their books into things that are helpful to forests rather than maybe undermining forests? So I guess I'll just close that bit by saying that I think that the Tropical Forest Forever facility is necessary but insufficient by itself in order to achieve the goals as stated.
And I find it interesting that you mentioned that sort of multi-pronged trio of things that needs to happen. I feel like if at Glasgow you brought that up, people would maybe push back. But since then we've had, the global biodiversity framework and just an increasing focus on, the links between the biodiversity and the climate COP. So do you think we are at a sort of different juncture in a different stage of the conversation than we were back in Glasgow?
Yeah, I absolutely do, Sarah. It's really interesting. As people may recall, in 1992, out of Rio, there were three global conventions that were signed. One was the Convention on Biological Diversity, one was the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and one was the Convention on Combating Desertification. I think what's happening right now is people are actually seeing that these three things are all interrelated, or they're addressing issues that are interrelated. And the core of all three of those, not the only thing, but the core of them is, can we do a better job of managing our land? I mean, that's essential for the biodiversity COP. It's essential for the combating desertification COP. It's one of the, arguably the four big pillars of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so I think at this COP in Belem, there's just a lot more conversation around the integration of things. In the past, people would talk about climate and nature, or they would talk about climate and biodiversity, or climate, biodiversity, and desertification. Now I think you just sort of start to hear like the terms coming together, and people are recognizing that we can't achieve our climate goals without dealing with nature. We can't achieve our nature goals without dealing with climate, and desertification sort of undermines some ecosystems in a very significant way.
Got it. I think as well, the fact as well that people are using the language more of tipping points and earth systems, even as you mentioned earlier, is probably important to that. And I did want to turn to the sort of earth systems piece and something that's on the agenda after COP. So we've got all eyes on Brazil for now, but it's been said on this series before that the more important thing is the 50 weeks of the year in between the COPs. So when I look at what's coming up for yourself and the forum, Jack, the obvious thing is Davos in the new year. So I wanted to get your view on how you and your teams are preparing, and whether you expect that same focus, so that forest biodiversity, but linked with everything else we've mentioned, to feature on that agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two things that are going on here, Sarah. One is that I think people are now really understanding the importance of nature in this broader conversations around climate. And so we've been, over the years, trying to increase the profile of the nature conversation. I don't think we have our language quite down yet, to tell you the truth, because often when people think about nature, they think about something that's a luxury and it's a nice walk in the woods, rather than a fundamental system that underpins our entire society. But I think we're making some progress on really framing that in a way that people get it. And, the SBTI, SBTN, the Task Force on Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, these mechanisms are really pushing that concept into corporate decision making, I think. And so we have a little bit of a better opportunity to really elevate the importance of this subject and profile it at Davos. We plan to do a number of things in the forest space, specifically around financing of forests, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, like the different elements of the financial puzzle. So we'll be doing some work around that in Davos, and specifically trying to pick up with Brazilian colleagues everything that comes out of COP. Davos is a next way station, if you will, for these types of global conversations. So we're definitely going to be focusing time and attention on the post-COP environment. I'd also like to just say something about ocean, because the ocean wasn't profiled that much in Brazil. And there's probably a whole bunch of good reasons for that. Maybe the land conversation just eclipsed it. But I think people are really understanding more significantly the role that the ocean plays in sequestration, I guess, of CO2, and also driving weather patterns. And so one of the things we're doing in the Earth Systems agenda is we're going to be profiling an integrated program around ocean, where we're really trying to drive finances and sort of leading businesses into ocean investments that are sort of nature positive. They're leaning towards sort of a net zero mentality, and they're consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's sort of going to be the big push for the World Economic Forum over the coming years, driving resources into the ocean in a way that is going to be consistent with not only the Framework Convention on Climate Change, but also the other two conventions that we mentioned at the outset. So I think it's pretty exciting.
Looking at all the international events about oceans this summer really had me nerding out, to be honest. This is really, really fascinating stuff. So, Jack, I'm sure you have a lot to prepare for all of that and a lot to watch in the coming days out of the COP. So I'll let you get on with that. But thank you very much for sparing the time to come on COP30 Covered.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate the fact that you're asking about these questions, and I'm glad to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks once again to Jack for his time. And that's almost everything for today. As we have mentioned, the next couple of days are still all very much about nature and food systems at the COP, and we'll also hopefully have more draft documents to debrief you on as well. So our new episode tomorrow, Wednesday 19th of November, will be looking at the presence of the agriculture value chain at the COP. And then, as Matilda's alluded to a little bit later in the week, Springwise will be doing a takeover to look at AI and answering your questions about, does AI help or hinder the Paris Agreement? So a massive question for you to tackle in 30 minutes, Matilda. I'm not jealous.
Yeah, no, there's a lot to get your teeth stuck into. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, but we'll do our best to summarise in half an hour or less.
Surely you can just answer it with a yes or no, right? That'd be the Edie Shorts podcast.
We'll
Can
ask ChatGPT to shorten the script. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, just don't ask Matt GPT, Matilda. He'll be here for 2 hours.
But
But those are a taste of our episodes later in the week. But in the meantime, we're running daily written coverage of the COP on edie.net. We'll also be running a free to attend post-COP debrief webinar next Tuesday. That's November 25th, which we are delighted to host in partnership with Ecology. So you can find all the information on registering for that on edie.net as well. But that is everything for this particular episode. So hopefully see some more of you listening tomorrow and on that webinar, of course. For today, it's goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye.
It's a goodbye from Matilda.
Goodbye.
And it's a goodbye from me. Goodbye.